All right, so we recognize that hormones play a role both in primary sex determination, in secondary sex characteristics, as well as in the behaviors that males and females express as they age, but that hormones themselves are also bioculturally mediated, right? That we see a lot of variation in hormone levels, and we see a lot of socialization towards acceptable quote unquote maleness and femaleness that comes from culturally constructed ideas. So now we're going to address um, kind of a hot button topic here of why is there inequality between men and women? Why do men, with very few exceptions, hold the leadership roles in society? Right. So this gets at what is effectively known as the patriarchy, right? And we also refer, kind of as a corollary of the patriarchy, we talk about societies that have a culture of misogyny. So this is something that interest in goes back to Victorian times with some of the earliest anthropological studies. Okay, so European cultures and American cultures are incredible patriarchies, and well, there are some predictable reasons for this. So we're going to take a step back. We're going to talk about some things that aren't present in the textbook, and that relate definitely to cultural anthropology, but also a little bit to what we would call evolutionary anthropology. Okay, so we've talked already about adaptive strategies. And one of the things that I stated during our discussion of adaptive strategies was that there were two big reasons for cultures being similar. One of those reasons is cultural phylogeny, that is, the cultures come from the same culture, same kind of parent culture. But the other reason is that they share an adaptive strategy. And so, what do we mean by this? Well, we mean that cultural features found in foragers are very similar across the globe wherever we see foragers. Cultural features of horticulturalists are very similar wherever we see horticulturalists, and so on, pastoralists and agriculturalists. So, one of the things that we see present in foragers and small scale horticulturalists. And we saw this present in My Story of a Coon Woman. We see a female centered kind of society where there's a lot to gain by females being surrounded by their kin. And so um, girls don't leave their mother's group when they marry a male. Instead, the male comes in and starts living with the female's family. And that's what Gunda did during My Story of a Kunkulan. This is associated with economic exchange, that is, that hunter gatherers, foragers engage in bride service, where the prospective groom comes and hunts for the bride's family for a period of months or years. And we saw Gunda doing that for Nai's father. Um, in small scale horticultural populations where we don't have a lot of uh, violence and we've got low population density, similarly, there's a benefit to females being surrounded by their female kin because they can collectively raise offspring. So much of what we would consider our evolutionary state would have been gender equality, would have been relatively equal amounts of power between males and females. So, where did it all go wonky? Well, a lot of that happened as we shifted from what we call somatic wealth to extrasomatic wealth. And so this becomes prevalent certainly in pastoral populations when your wealth is measured in the size of your herd. This is also prevalent in agricultural populations where your wealth is measured by the amount of land that you own. And this also becomes more critical in horticultural populations with high population density because we start seeing endemic raiding and warfare. And so, anywhere where warfare becomes prevalent, we have a very abrupt shift to male centered society. We see a very abrupt shift away from female centered society. And so, this is where we get the emergence of the patriarchy. And so, when we look throughout history, we're looking for shifts in adaptive strategy. So, no surprise among herding populations, males have most of the power, males have rights of ownership, Females have very little. You saw this in Maasai women, right? That the females got a starter herd that were essentially hers to control, but they were really set in place for her to be able to pass on to her own offspring, her own sons, for bride price when it was time for them to marry. In agricultural societies, as we've talked a little bit when talking about some work that Jim Boone did with Portugal between 1380 and 1580, um, when land is not at a premium, we have what's called bilateral partible inheritance, which means that inheritance is split between both your male and female offspring and split relatively equally, partitioned out. As soon as land becomes at a premium and you can't just go out and conquer more land, then we have a very abrupt shift to what we call unigeniture, which means inheritance is going to be funneled into a single male offspring. Now, that, remember, can be either primogeniture, firstborn male, or ultimogeniture, lastborn male. But the fact of the matter remains that suddenly property and inheritance becomes concentrated in the hands of males, and females then experience lower status. So these are the kinds of questions that, as populations that weren't land-based agriculturalists, like most of Europe was during the Victorian era, as populations that were still foraging or practicing small-scale horticulture were encountered, people started to wonder, why is it that they've got relative gender equality? Why is it that males don't have more power than females? This question never got very far until Simone de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex. This is what really spawned what we call a new wave of feminist anthropology in 1949. Most feminist anthropologists agreed that cultural ideologies and social relations play a greater role in gender inequality than biological differences. And I mean, nowhere is this more prevalent than when we compare foraging populations to agricultural populations, right? The notion among foraging populations that, you know, most production is at the hands of females. I mean, this is true in horticultural populations as well. That doesn't mean that meat is not more highly valued than carbohydrates, but females pretty much always are able to produce something to eat. Males have differential luck and more often than not strike out on the hunt and don't come back with any meat. So, you know, really valuing females' contribution to the diet versus this notion that females are unfit for labor and really belong in the kitchen barefoot and pregnant, right? So our ancestral state, our evolutionary state, would have been gender equality, and all of this inequality that we see is on the basis of cultural differences, on the basis of cultural conditioning. So the 1970s and 1980s saw an ongoing debate over the universality and causes of inequality. So first, it was this debate of, do we find inequality in every population? And then it was the debate over what are the causes. Some argued that inequality was universal owing to some basic association, mainly that women would interact with nature and that women would focus most of their attention on the domestic sphere, whereas men would interact with culture, possess culture, and that men would attend to things that happen in the public sphere. Others argued that inequality was not so fundamental, but it was a result of specific historical processes like capitalism and colonialism. All right, so given what we just talked about on the previous slide, where do you fall? Are women the weaker sex? Do we innately, biologically, have inequality? Well, by now you should really feel almost enraged when someone would say that there's a biological basis for this inequality, because it's not. I mean, this debate is functionally settled, at least among anthropologists, even though that doesn't translate into equal rights across males and females. So your text will say that this is an unresolved debate. Gender inequality is not a thing, but a process, and that we should really refocus on how that process is performed and reproduced. Gender inequality is reinforced most certainly through cultural mechanisms. And so we've got to question cultural processes that seem to inevitably place men above women in terms of power and authority. All right, so what does all this mean? Well, anywhere you go in the world today, I mean, chances are in about 90% of societies around the world, males have greater political control. There is a pretty high degree of gender inequality. And part of that is due to notions of females being the weaker sex and kind of biologically conditioned for nurturing. And part of that has to do with something that in our own culture we're finally recognizing as toxic masculinity. Ideas of masculinity do not inherently promote sexism or male dominance. That masculinity is something to be attained is pervasive in many cultures. So we recognize that definitions of masculinity are culturally specific, and that different cultures define masculinity in different ways. Um, the notion that women are born or part of nature and men are created or encultured helps to explain the importance of male initiation rites in so many societies. We do find some pretty big cross cultural trends. And some of these definitely relate to this notion of masculinity. If meat is consumed, almost always men perform a role in terms of that meat production. If there's hard labor to be done, like felling trees and building boats, more often than not, males take place in those kinds of tasks. Women tend to engage in tasks that are compatible with childcare because the bulk of childcare duties tend to fall on women's shoulders. Does that mean that men are not able to care for their own offspring? No, of course not. It doesn't. It's just a cross cultural generality. So this leaves us with this idea that women naturally know what they're supposed to do in this domestic sphere. That somehow you were born with that innate knowledge of how to vacuum and how to mend tears in clothing and how to cook meals. And men weren't. We all know that's bunk, right? We all know that you learn the things that you're culturally exposed to, and that a lot of both masculinity and femininity are conditioned. They come at the hands of culture. So if masculinity is defined by cultural processes and femininity is defined by cultural processes, guess what? We can change those. They're not inevitable, they're not innate. And so, one of the first steps in changing these trends is, of course, to recognize them. So, what is toxic masculinity? Well, we we really we set up a hard kind of goal for males to be able to achieve in our society, right? They grow up hearing messages that boys don't cry, man up, grow a pair, etc., that showing emotions makes you weak. Then in heteronormative relationships, women bemoan the fact that men don't talk about their feelings. Well, why would they talk about their feelings when at every step along the way they've had their parents, they've had society telling them that men having feelings or feelings that are, except for perhaps anger, aggression, is wrong, right? Is something that needs to be suppressed. So we've also had a cultural history of characterizing those males who do express emotion as effeminate, as mama's boys, etc. So we've created this context in which we expect our males uh, to be stoic. We expect our males to show nothing but anger. We expect our males not to be overcome with sadness. We expect our males not to sit around and talk about their feelings. We also justify aggression among young males more than we do among young females. So, there's a physical fight. We roll our eyes and say, boys will be boys, right? We encourage our young males to stand up for themselves, to not put up with bullying, name calling, etc. We also condition our young girls to expect that men show love through pain. When they're being chased, when they're being hit by boys, we tell them that that's how they show that they like you. So, should it surprise us when we reach reproductive age and suddenly we've got an uptick in domestic violence, right? So, toxic masculinity is detrimental to both males and females. And we really need to pay more explicit, more intentional attention to the messages that we're giving to our young boys and girls. One of the things is that when men say they're babysitting, you're not babysitting if you're taking care of your own offspring. You're simply parenting, right? But that we give them accolades if they spend 2 hours with their kids on a Saturday afternoon. All right. So the relationship between masculinity and male dominance changes through time. Matthew Gutman in 1996 did some research with Mexico City and showed that Mexican masculinity was more dynamic than just the stereotypes of inflexible, domineering machos suggest, so that there was more to it than just that machismo culture. Some of the specific factors that influenced Mexican masculinity were women's role in the workforce, boys and girls having equal status in schools, and the global feminist movement. And this has been noted in the United States as well, particularly in the 1970s, that as more women pursued work outside of the home, women's status rose. That as girls were as encouraged to complete their education, that female status rose. That as feminist issues came to the forefront, that female status rose. So does that mean that we've done away with the patriarchy, that we've done away with the culture of misogyny? Well, no, it absolutely doesn't. And perhaps disturbingly, we've seen some reversals on much of the progress that women fought for in the 1970s and 1980s. Ask yourselves, are men and women equal? Okay, you might think that they are. Now ask yourselves, constitutionally, are men and women equal? Right? We've had amendments that set equality based on skin color, that have at least paved the way for racial equality, even though we haven't quite gotten there yet. But we've had an Equal Rights Amendment addressing gender that has been introduced in almost every Congress since the 1970s that has yet to pass. And in fact, corporations have more rights of personhood than women do. And nowhere is this more evident than in the debate over women's bodily autonomy over their reproductive decisions, right? The debate over abortion. Now, I'm not espousing that you choose one viewpoint or the other when it comes to something like abortion, but we should question the fact that men and the government have the right to uh, intervene and decide women's reproductive decisions, but don't do similar sorts of actions for men's reproductive decisions. So just something to keep in the back of your mind. We still have not passed an Equal Rights Amendment, even as we did redefine personhood to include corporations with respect to decisions over like providing contraceptions on insurance plans and stuff. So corporations are people too, but women aren't. All right, so thinking critically about gender, sex, and sexuality, inequalities between men and women are reproduced and performed in many different ways in daily life. Can you identify examples in the following? Advertising. Have you seen burger advertisements? I mean, I would say Carl's Jr. is probably the worst, right? How do they use advertising? Well, often with women as sex objects. Sports. Okay, we've got some big issues with regards to equality in sports. There's a reason that we have Title IX. We have Title IX specifically because we've not had historically equal access to sporting opportunities for males and females. But we've got differences in pay that became more well known after the women won like the last World Cup. And argued for equal chances or equal opportunities in pay. Just even sports participation, right? we don't have women's professional sports. We do have men's professional sports. And people would say, well, that's because people aren't just interested in watching women's professional sports. Well, it has more to do with the advertising, kind of the economic status that we ascribe to male professional sports, right? If we put the same kind of investments into women's professional sports, we'd probably have uh, quite a cultural difference. Language. Women talk too much. Women talk about their feelings. Cooking, right? Whose job is it to cook after a long day when both parents have been at work? Well, at least about 7 times out of 10, it falls on the shoulders of females, even among partnerships that espouse that they are truly partners in domestic duties. Shopping, right? Shopping is supposedly something that only women and gay men appreciate. Well, I know plenty of women who really don't like shopping. I know men who do like shopping but are scared to admit that they like shopping because they don't want to be labeled gay. How has culture influenced our perception of what's masculine and what's feminine across all of these measures? At the same time, these inequalities are often challenged by both men and women. So, what are some of the challenges that we see? Well, I mean, women are speaking up. The soccer teams, first and foremost, for equal pay and equal opportunity. So academically, we still have sexism, and there are a large number of women who are speaking up about that. There are fields that are traditionally, um, historically, the venue of white men. Think about like some of the STEM fields and such. So think about the messages that you receive from CNM, from administrators at any schools that you work with, right? Teaching is a fundamentally female occupation, as is nursing. Why? Well, because they were seen as more nurturing occupations, and as such, get paid a heck of a lot less for a quote unquote nurturing feminine occupation than you do for a strong masculine one, like doctors or administrators or engineers and such. So we are subconsciously, unconsciously reinforcing gender inequality with a lot of the comments that we say, a lot of the behaviors that we practice.